Welcome to the SmartTechCheck Podcast, hosted by Mark Vina, your home for candid, insightful, and provocative conversations about the smart home automation, security, smartphones, PC and console gaming, and much more.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Vina, host of the SmartTechCheck Podcast. Today is Thursday, June 16th, 2022. Joining me for today's podcast is Stuart Walpin, who scribes for Popular Mechanics, U.S. News, Techlicious, Investopedia, and other publications. John Quain, who writes for New York Times, Smart Cities, and Tom's Guide, and Rob Pecoraro, who writes frequently on tech policy for Wirecutter, PC Magazine, USA Today, could not be with us today. But, hey, we don't need those guys, Stuart. Welcome to the podcast. And no, really seriously.
Watch this.
They'll probably protest that I said that about them, but they're doing other things right now, and they'll be back on podcast next week. Before we get into some of our great topics that I've teed up today, I'm going to tell you, Yankees are 30 games over 500. Who knows if they've, they can keep the momentum going. But as a fellow committed Met fan, which I know you are, the Mets are having a pretty good season this year. What's your assessment of the Yankees, real quick, just for a minute? I got to ask that question. You think they're for real?
Well, everything rests on starting pitching, and Garrett Cole has been uneven, shall we say. Luis Severino has been a surprise, and I think that I don't think they expected him to be this good this soon again. Jordan Montgomery and Talion, whose first name escapes me at the moment, have both been pitching over their usual or their career marks. I have Montgomery on my roto team.
Don't forget Nestor.
So if their starting pitching holds up, if they get Chapman back at some point and he's at least somewhat effective, their bullpen is certainly held up without Chapman. I would suspect that they're probably going to try to add some bullpen help at the trade deadline, because I don't know what Chapman's condition is. But they certainly have a loaded lineup. They're batting Judge leadoff, for crying out loud.
I know.
He's having
and the guy's having an MVP season.
Right. I just don't understand. I understand batting him second, at least get somebody on base in front of him. Batting him leadoff, I understand getting him more at bats. It's just I don't know. It upends all tradition, and it probably makes statistical sense. I'm sure Aaron Boone isn't doing it, just to throw it out there. But they have a huge, deep lineup. Putting him at the top of the order really deepens that lineup quite a bit. And when they get Donaldson is back from his suspension, his disgusting suspension. It just gives them an enormously deep lineup. And so it probably the deepest in the league right now. I think Gleyber Torres is somewhat of a surprise from his offense for them. I don't think, and certainly I'm going to screw up his name. Feiner Kalila, the shortstop. He and Matt Chapman have contributed way over expectations. So again, I think there's some things that are sort of a mirage at the moment, whether or not Chapman and Connor Falala will come back to earth or not. Again, I think they need to add bullpen, but I think they have a deep enough lineup that certainly will be able to bash their way to the Eastern Crown at least.
Well, with all those glowing comments, I'm sure you're going to be returning your season tickets for the Mets. And I do know somebody in the New York Yankee ticket office that can probably get you really good seats.
I had Yankee season tickets at one point.
Oh, did you? I didn't know that.
I couldn't afford both. I had great seats at Yankees in the upper deck, right in the first row, right behind home plate. They were just absolutely fabulous seats. And I, the guys I was keeping them with, and I couldn't afford both those and my Met tickets, so I had to choose one or the other.
And you chose those bums from Flushing. Okay, I get it. Well, let's hit our first topic here, and that is I want to drill down a little bit. We talked a bit about it last week during our WWDC recap, and that is talking about CarPlay and Apple's long-term strategy. And I'm actually interested in your opinion, Stuart, because unlike our friend John Quain, who's a big subject matter expert on the car space. Specifically, you're not a car guy. You don't own a car.
I haven't owned a car in 40 years,
which is amazing. But the interesting to me thing about what Apple's doing here with their next iteration of CarPlay is, for those people who don't know, I mean, they're essentially going to deploy the iteration of this new version of CarPlay into things beyond just entertainment and Apple Maps. So in theory, Apple will be able to, if they get access, of course, from the car manufacturer, they'll be able to access things like the air conditioning, climate controls, other systems within the car, essentially the speedometer, do it in a highly graphical, intuitive way that like only Apple can do. So it'll probably, the eye candy will probably be incredible from a visuality standpoint. But the question I raise is that as Apple, expands its presence in the cabin of the car and takes over more screens, or essentially becomes an Apple experience when you're in the car. It's not a BMW experience. It's not an Audi experience. They're owning the experience. Do you think that car manufacturers are going to be really crazy about that simply because they know what Apple did, in the MP3 music space, where they pretty much dominated the space, and the MP3 device space never really recovered after Apple monetized music? So what's your thoughts about that? If you, I know you do have some thoughts on it, and it'd be interesting to get your perspective.
Well, it's fascinating to me, just from a pure technology evolution point of view, that everything that Apple is doing now is essentially all pointed down the road to a totally autonomous vehicle. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing all these fits and starts at both the telemetrics point of view, the wireless communication, the 5G communication systems that will allow the cars to learn and from each other as they drive. And so there's that end of it. And then that's the hardware and the operational side. And that's something car makers essentially know how to do, and they can buy that talent, essentially. Software is something that is totally alien to the car community.
Yes.
And so they are going to need partners like Apple, partners like Google, who know software. They've forgotten more about software than the car makers ever knew. And for the car makers, I think that they are probably want to be in a position of aligning themselves with such well-known companies. Remember, it's Android and it's iOS in the phone space. And so every consumer that these car makers are selling to owns one of those two devices.
Right.
And as we have seen with Apple, their Apple Store, or the iTunes Store, is available on Android. So there isn't that much of a conflict. So for the car makers to lay off the software side on people who know what they're doing makes perfect sense. Plus, despite all that we're about to talk about after this with Apple and Google in terms of antitrust thing, people trust Apple. Right. Regardless of what the government may or may not do on the antitrust side, people trust Apple. Rightly or wrongly, it's a trust thing. And if American drivers see that Apple is going to help them drive better, that's again a plus for the automaker, who may not have. I mean, who would trust software from General Motors? So
well, and to your point, they flashed up a statistic at WWDC, and it was an Apple study, but let's accept it for what it's worth, that 79 or 80% of people that were polled would not buy a new car unless it had Apple CarPlay support.
Again, that makes perfect sense.
They won the branding. They won the branding game.
Apple is the leading smartphone seller in the United States, unlike the rest of the world, where it's Android by a much wider margin. Apple is more than 50% of the market in the U.S. So again, it makes perfect sense for U.S. automakers to partner with somebody to provide them something with that they can not only can't do themselves, have no expertise in, but no consumer trust in. So that makes perfect sense for them to do it. But again, I think this is what Apple is good at. One of the things that Apple is good at is looking, and you'll excuse the pun, looking way down the road. Right. That their roadmap, that all of this software that they are developing for all of these screens is all preparation for the fully autonomous vehicle. Because right now, I do drive. I rent cars on occasion. I use Zipcar, to drive, and I learned to drive a manual transmission on a furniture truck. So I consider myself a very heady driver. But when I drive a car and my wife is sitting next to me, I don't want her talking to me because I don't want to be distracted. And so all of these screens, and you and I both know, you ask Siri a question and you got a 50-50 shot of her answering, and all of a sudden you're yelling at your phone. You do not want to be doing that in a car. So Apple still has a huge amount of work to do if they're going to have a voice operated car. It's going to have to be a situation as in more widely accepted adoption of voice, is that the systems need to understand the humans instead of the humans needing to make themselves understood to the devices, which is the way it is now. If you don't use the right syntax, the right words, the machine doesn't understand you. And a fully autonomous vehicle cannot, from a pure safety point of view, operate that way, where I have to think in my head, what do I have to say to my car in order to do something? It has to be completely organic, where if I'm talking to the car, it has to be just like I'm talking to you. Turn on the air conditioning. I shouldn't have to, go Siri air conditioning or whatever that syntax would have to be. So I think what they're doing now is preparation. It's all part of the building block to get us to a point where all of that happens in a fully autonomous vehicle.
So let me jump in there for a second, because the not the cynical part, because Apple at the end they has to make money. My view of this is that if Apple, because they already have, in my view, they've won the hearts and minds of most people who are buying new cars. Let's accept that study as fact. That's number one. If they succeed in this next iteration of CarPlay, where they essentially own every screen in the car, and if you go one step further in an autonomous vehicle context, where you don't have to worry about steering the car. I mean, we could argue whether that's 2 years out, 5 years out, or whenever that's going to happen. But if all of a sudden the driver becomes a passenger, and all of a sudden now advertising on those screens becomes a very, very attractive opportunity from a monetization standpoint. And I really think that Apple knows that, and not just on a car that they might sell, but if they own all the screens in a BMW or an Audi or some type of other non-Apple branded car, which, by the way, the car makers are not going to like, because they want that revenue as well. All of a sudden now you're going to have a lot of, I think right now you probably see a lot of tension between Apple and car makers, because the car makers know that. And the screen experience in a car is very much part of the brand persona for a car manufacturer. And I guess my point is, I'm not sure Audi or Apple, I'm not Apple, but Lexus, or pick your car brand, wants to concede that brand experience to Apple.
I don't think that's a major concern, for one reason.
Mm-hmm.
Apple's not in the advertising business right now. They don't sell ads for anything.
But that doesn't mean they won't do it in the future.
I understand that, but their whole point in terms of privacy and security is, we're not capturing your data. And the second they become a buyer or a seller of advertising, that changes. And I think from a pure privacy, a part of the Apple trust by the consumers is, consumers know that Apple is not collecting their data. And the second Apple starts to do that by instituting an advertising program, that goes away. And I think Apple is very smart, and I don't think that they would do anything to jeopardize the trust that consumers have in their company. And if consumers think that Apple all of a sudden is now advertising and collecting data from them, that trust erodes. And that's, I think, far more important than any residual dollars that they may make from advertising. So my own thought is that the car makers will probably retain that and maybe kick some stuff back to Apple without Apple having to actually be in the business of actually selling the space. I think they'll leave that to the car makers.
No, but that may be a way out, but at the end of the day, Apple's going to have to accommodate as part of their interface. And, again, if you have a CarPlay 2.0 interface where Ford is doing ads, and they're the ones, taking the heat, frankly, for the data sharing and the privacy issues that you related. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm still up in the air that whether Apple at some point will not get more aggressive about advertising. To your point, they've avoided.
It doesn't make any sense to me, especially since the car makers, the ads directed at buyers of the car makers, is going to be dependent to a certain extent on information they have on their consumers. So in other words, the ads that somebody might see in a Ford Taurus are going to be different than the ads that somebody's going to see in a Land Rover. And
yeah, that's exactly my point, though, because the ad kickback to the car manufacturer or to Apple is much more lucrative. If you're watching an ad,
I don't think it's about lucrative. I think it's about targeting, and the car makers are far better positioned to target their own consumers than Apple will be, especially since for Apple to be attuned to that means collecting user data. And they are not going to do that. That is their entire point of not only differentiation, but keeps the government off their backs, at least as far as privacy and security is concerned. And I don't think Apple will do anything to threaten its reputation in the public eye or in the eye of regulators.
Well, let's we got to go back to the next topic. For a guy who doesn't own a car, you know a lot about this topic, Stuart. But you have an opinion about everything. The only thing I will leave.
I have an opinion about that.
The only thing I'll leave you about this is that it will be very interesting, as I was telling you before we did the podcast, started the podcast, is that, if you play this out with CarPlay, call it CarPlay 2.0, and this next iteration where Apple is controlling more, or monitoring more subsystems in the car, Apple engineers are going to want more access to recommending, this is a going forward statement, making recommendations to Ford, to the other car companies, saying, you know what, we think we'd get a better experience if you put this type of sensor in the car, this type of brand. And I'm not sure car companies are going to like that, saying, hey, are you going
to remember,
tell me how to do
the entire reason that there is an iPhone to begin with was because of that exact situation.
Yes.
And Motorola came out with the rocker and that had an iTunes software on it. It was a disaster. And Steve Jobs said, I am never going to let anybody make hardware that uses our software.
Right.
So Steve Jobs obviously is not there anymore, but the philosophy is still probably residual in the minds of many at Apple, that to simply give their software to another hardware maker for the hardware maker to somehow screw it up is not in Apple's mindset. So, talking about whether or not Apple will do a car or not, that leads me to believe that they are probably strongly, leaning towards doing that because that is their legacy. Not leave the hardware to other people, to create that integrated hardware software experience that you can't do if you're not making the hardware yourself.
I agree with you violently, because that's the same philosophy they take with their notebooks, not just smartphones, but hey, we can only provide a great experience because we control everything. And ultimately that may be the reason why that an Apple car needs to exist. But having said that, it's going to be interesting to see the way that part of the discussion kind of plays out. Let's go to the next topic here. This kind of interesting type of thing is that Apple cut a deal with MSL, the soccer league. I'm not a big soccer guy, but I've been told by people that that particular league is not exactly. Am I characterizing it incorrectly, Stuart? It's not like Major League Baseball or the National Football League. So it's an interesting deal, but it doesn't run from a prestige standpoint. It's the same thing as it would be if they,
it's not the Premier League.
Yes. So, but to your point, I think you and I were talking about this before, is that maybe this is the precursor to the deal that they're rumored to be cutting with the NFL. They have cut a deal with Major League Baseball on this Friday Night Baseball deal, which has been kind of interesting. But would love to get your thoughts on where this may all be headed.
Well, my interest in this is based on a singular experience that I do not know is widespread or not. Somebody else would have to tell me, and I'd have to double blind test it. But here's the story.
Yeah,
the MLB app enables you to set notifications, so you can get a notification if you're in the score of a game changes. That I follow the Mets, so every time during a Met game, if the Mets score or the team they're playing scores, I get a note on my iPhone. I get a notification on my watch. I was at the Met game on Tuesday night against the Brewers, and I got those, and I'm watching the game and I'm keeping score, so I know what's going on. But I didn't turn the notifications off; it's too much trouble. And so about 30 seconds after somebody drives in a run, I get a notification on my watch. When I'm home and I'm watching the Met game on SNY in New York, the Mets regional sports outlet, I get the notification about 10 seconds or so after I see it on television. Okay, last Friday night, I'm watching the Mets playing the Angels on Apple TV. No score in the game, so nothing is happening. And then all of a sudden, my watch buzzes. So-and-so has doubled in 2 runs for the Mets. And I'm looking at the screen and nothing is happening. It's the batter is still at the plate. And sure enough, 2 pitches later, he hits a 2-run double. And I went, wait a minute. I'm getting a notification of what's happening from a game that's streaming before I actually see it as it's streaming. That's not good. And I'm not a sports bettor. I hate the whole idea of sports betting. But can you imagine a world in which all sports have streamed and they somehow have not solved this latency issue where people are notified of an event happening before it happens on the screen?
Well, and I'll tell you something that's kind of funny is that's been kind of my life story here, being California and being a Yankees fan. I watch everything streaming, and I like to play a parlor game where if I'm with people and I get that alert instantly before the video feed picks
so it's
up.
Not just me.
No, I tell people, hey, by the way, I'll bet you $50 that on the next pitch this player is going to hit a home run, and it happens. And of course, most people are not privy to that latency issue. How the hell did you predict that? So to me, it's an inconvenience. I mean, to me, outside of the betting implications, which is interesting, I didn't really think about that. To me, it ruins the experience because I don't want to know, in advance, even a millisecond or a couple of, or a second before then something's going to happen. I mean, it allows me to kind of stand up and take notice because baseball is a very casual game. And, baseball drives a lot of people who are not into baseball crazy because it has such a leisurely pace to it. But, it allows me, oh, by the way, something is exciting is going to happen. Let me stop what I'm doing because like you, I always have the baseball game playing in the background. That's the way I grew up. Even during the family dinners, which used to drive my mother crazy, that Yankee game on WPIX with Phil Rizzuto was in the background. My mother, to this day, she's 88 years old. She would say, that man's voice drives me crazy. And she would talk about Phil Rizzuto. But the point is that as a fan, it is a kind of a distracting experience. Go one step further. The streaming apps, one of the nice things that you can do, I don't know if you do it, is that, the Yankee video broadcast team is different from the radio broadcast team with John Sterling. Now,
I know what you're going to say. You listen to the Yankee broadcast while watching the stream.
On the radio, and I like Michael
And unfortunately, they don't match up.
Right, but they do sync it, though. I mean, it does sync relatively closely. It's not perfect, but they do try to sync it, which is that, to me, that really, I just enjoy.
Wait a minute. On the streaming, you can choose a different broadcast. That's what you're saying.
Radio,
I'm sorry. I thought you meant that you were listening to the radio.
No.
While you were watching the game.
What you can essentially do on the MLB app is that you can go in and change the audio feed to a radio broadcast.
Yeah, you can do that on the app. Can you do it on the Apple TV streaming?
I think you can as well. Go into the video audio
option.
The next time. And the reason why I say that now, a lot of people don't like John Sterling. The man is 100 years old and he blows a lot of calls that it's supposed to be home runs and they catch it on the warning track. But putting that aside, that to me is part of baseball. I mean, it's the audio broadcast, because baseball is very much a medium for audio because you can follow the game in your mind if you have the right announcer. So, but I agree with you. That is an annoying problem that needs to be addressed. And I had
to take, and I'll tell you the other thing, I had to take off my watch and I had to put down my phone while the action was going on. And as well as I do, when you're home and you're watching a ball game, it's great background while you're doing other things, as you just mentioned. Right. And so I'm always on my laptop or on my phone while I'm watching the game. I'm looking up stats, I'm doing work, I'm checking email. And every pitch is every 30 seconds. I know when to look up when there's a pitch about to happen. But now I couldn't do that because I would get an alert on my phone before the action on the screen took place. And I think this is a huge issue. And I have no idea whether or not the reason we haven't heard from Apple and the NFL is I don't know if this might be one of those issues, that the streaming latency is interfering essentially with how anybody actually watches, sports fans watch a game, especially in this now new era of all the sports betting, where you're watching a game on streaming and can know what the scoring is going to be before it happens.
Right. Well, we really should do a podcast specifically on the relationship between sports betting and technology, because I got to tell you, on the November ballot, California finally will probably get on. And they'll probably, if the polls are accurate, Californians are probably going to approve sports betting. And I guarantee you, when the state of California gets behind it, it's going to be a really interesting environment, because all of a sudden, all these issues about latency and other things are going to start to kick in. And by the way, not just sports betting on professional sports. You're going to see sports betting when it's legalized completely out here in California on online gaming. So if I'm playing Madden 2023 or MLB The Show, which is the most popular baseball game on Xbox and PlayStation, you're gonna you can do it right now, but you have to establish an account in the Virgin Islands, and they put credit. You got to.
It's the same thing with poker. Same thing with online poker.
That's right.
If we're going to do a whole podcast on this, that means that I'm actually have to use these betting apps, and I don't want to.
Well, I'm going to do it anyway, just to upset you.
No, won't do it. I have no interest.
Right. Well, let me bring up the last topic for us to tackle today, and that is, and I know you have some opinions about this, but there's a couple of bipartisan bills in the Congress right now that's really aiming at trying to curb these anti-competitive practices that you know and love, and you've spoken quite a bit about, Stuart, with Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Being kind of an ex-product guy, and kind of I don't see myself as a representative of the technology mavens that bring all this wonderful technology to the market, but I always get a bit nervous, and you and I have talked about this before, is when Congress tries to get involved in helping and they end up hurting, frankly, or creating unintended consequences. So let's talk about that.
Well, there are two bills, and John Oliver this past Sunday did a whole segment. It's his major segment of the show on this very topic, and he's very insightful. I think he missed a couple of things, which I'll get into in a moment. And obviously, there's a bipartisan effort to curb the practices of big tech, and we are talking about 4 or 5 companies essentially. Both of the bills, and there is some overlap between them, are aimed at 4 or 5 companies: Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and, like the vowels, sometimes Microsoft. And all the rules, most of the things in the bills cover companies that have 50 million of this or 500 million of that, so they're clearly targeted at those 4 or 5 companies. As you mentioned, trusting Congress to understand this and also the unintended consequences, really hard for me. Amy Klobuchar, who is the Democratic sponsor, Chuck Grassley is the Republican sponsor of the bigger of the 2 bills. Amy Klobuchar does know what she's talking about. I'm not so sure about Grassley. Klobuchar has even written a book about this. But a lot of these bills, a lot of the subject matter in the bills are based upon what the European Union has already done and is being litigated. I've read through both pieces of legislation, and a lot of it rests on one of the key provisions in both of them, this idea of I'm having a senior moment. Self-recommendation. There's I've lost my topic. Oh, damn it! What's it called? Well, anyway, it's the self-preferencing. Sorry, just bringing it. Self-preferencing. The idea is that when you go on Amazon, for instance, and you look to say, I want to watch Casablanca, when Amazon lists the search results, it will put Amazon Prime at the top of that list. When you go to Google, which is something that John Oliver pointed out, and you put in a flight, say San Francisco to Houston, it will show you Google flight information, completely ignoring Expedia and Travelocity and Kayak.
And you might want to explain why does that happen? Because the search engine or the company behind it wants to get the revenue.
Of course. I mean, I think that's fairly right. The companies want to earn revenue from themselves. Here's the problem. The problem is this also covers things like when you buy an iPhone, there is pre-installed software. And so you have a and there is a huge there's a huge bulk of people who believe that I've lost my mind. Self-preferencing is not always a bad thing, that this is a regular business practice that often helps consumers, such as you buy an iPhone, it has some software already installed on it that work well with Apple's hardware and operating system. That makes perfect sense. Nobody protests about this. So the question is whether these two bills are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Instead of outlawing all self-preferencing, whether or not it needs to be a little more parsed by including what they call rule of reason, which is to let the courts decide whether there is actual harm in the self-preferencing instead of outlawing all self-preferencing. For instance, the self-preferencing was wrong from a competitive point of view back in the day when Microsoft was pre-installing Explorer on new computers. And the courts determined that it was anti-competitive because Netscape brought suit against them, essentially, and it was all part of the mid-90s effort to break up Microsoft, essentially. So there are some good instances of self-preferencing and some bad instances, and these laws as currently constituted seem to include all self-preferencing without any determination. The other thing that I noticed...
And just to jump in there, I mean, to me, an example of harm would be, using your Casablanca example, if Amazon, put Casablanca on Amazon Prime as for rent, let's say that wasn't part of the Prime package, you had to pay for the rental. If Amazon Prime is available to rent at $9.99 versus, I could rent that on another platform for $4.99, to me, and because Amazon in the search results that came out at the top, to me, that might be an evidence of harm. The consumer ended up paying a higher price.
I totally agree with you. But the point is that these bills seem to consider all self-preferencing by these big companies as bad. And I think an argument can be made that, again, you're painting with such a wide brush that you may be erasing some competitive advantages these companies have, and also erasing a lot of consumer benefits that do increase competition, quite frankly. So I think Congress, that is the holdup. There seems to be an insinuation that because of Schumer is the only one who can bring these up for votes, and there seemed to be bipartisan support for them because he has two daughters who work for two of these companies, that somehow that's keeping him from doing it. But I'm suspecting that some of the details in these bills are a little too simplistic and don't really get into nuance that is really going to be necessary. The other thing that I was a little disturbed by was that the remedies suggested seemed to be all coming from the government, that only the FTC or the Justice Department could bring suit, not individuals. And I'm not sure I'm sure they're doing it to restrict frivolous lawsuits, but again, this indicates that they haven't gone into a degree of nuance and laid out enough detail so as not to cause more harm than good by putting through bills that are where this is concerned, because the people writing them simply don't lack the knowledge, are vague.
Right. Well, I mean, but this is always a danger, when Congress gets into legislation like this, because to your point, I mean, I'm bothered by the Chuck Schumer piece that oh God, I can't believe it. A politician being influenced by members of his family.
Horrors.
Boy, I won't even go down that path, but it happens, unfortunately, all the time. Shockingly, there's really a lot of that stuff is allowed, which is part of the problem. But I just get a bit nervous when, you see pieces of legislation, even if it's bipartisan, that implement or or put in place cookie cutter answers that lack nuance, and because there are there's another flip side of this, just using that Casablanca example or flight information for that matter. At some point, there has to be let the consumer beware type of approach here, because at the end of the day, if a consumer has to take responsibility in that context, that I'm getting there's a bunch of recommendations are coming, whether I'm buying a plane ticket or recommending a movie. If that person is stupid enough to just, I'm going to go out with the first recommendation, which may have the highest price, well, who's to blame? Does the consumer have?
I think the problem with that argument is that you're leaving it up to consumers to be smart. And I think most laws are designed, consumer laws are to protect consumers who don't know any better. I'll tell you, I got an email the other day, and I'm trying to remember who it was from, but it looked real. And I'm very smart. I checked the email addresses to see where it's coming from, and this one was really, really good. And if I'm worried about whether or not this is a real email or not, and I finally determined it wasn't for other reasons, only because the company wouldn't send such an email. I run across this all the time, my wife and my family, and these people are insidious. So it's not a matter of simply you should know better. Sometimes you just can't know better. And there's a certain degree of trust when you see something that's like, I read it on the internet kind of thing, that you tend to trust it. So I think, again, that these laws need to have a certain amount of nuance. I mean, one of the things that John Oliver brought up was this thing called scraping. Yes. So you do a search on Google for something. I want to search for a restaurant. And at the top of the results is some information about this particular restaurant. You, the consumer, don't know that information might have come from Yelp because it's not credited. It simply appears on your screen in a text box. There's no way the consumer can know that is or is not. They don't want to say it's coming from Yelp because Yelp don't make any money from that. And so the only way that Yelp would make any money from you searching for information from them is to click on it and go to Yelp and be exposed to the ads that they have on their site. By Correct. Google scraping that information and putting it on their own set, they're not only making money for themselves, not only not crediting Yelp, but they're helping Yelp lose money, which reduces competition. And so that would be harmful. But now, Yelp has no recourse to write them a letter.
And that's a legitimate practice to go after, which, by the way, there's no laws against that. Hence,
there's no laws against that. It's simply a matter of if you're big enough to make trouble. Yeah.
But I just don't think consumers can wash their hands of responsibility. I mean, again, getting back to that example, because I think you could wrap your hands around the Casablanca example. If the search results came back with one recommendation, which was the highest price, got it. That seems really devious. They're suppressing results that might lead the consumer to a lower price on something. Got it. But at the end of the day, the example you cited with the email, it sounded like a phishing deal. Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, these bad guys, the bad actors, is like Rob Pegoraro likes to call them.
Which could be Google and Apple and Amazon.
But a lot of these emails, I mean, it looks so legitimately accurate. And I do the same thing because you've been around the block. You know the way an email address is supposed to be structured. 99 times out of 100, if you see a weird character, if they spell Microsoft the wrong way or whatever,
just check the actual email address. And I have to show my wife how to do that.
Right. But a lot of people don't do it. And by the way,
they don't know that they can.
Right. And it's particularly insidious with older people. My mother has been scammed several times where, I got this email, and by the way, I got a phone call. Microsoft called me on a robocall that says, hey, by the way, if you don't accept this $29 charge, all your data is going to be wiped off your phone. Older people don't get it. They don't have that level of sophistication.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Younger users do.
So I think we're talking at two different places. Your Casablanca example is a perfect instance where caveat emptor should certainly be exercised and can be exercised by the consumer. But the situation where Yelping getting credit for
Different
information
you're
being
right. I
scraped by
agree.
Google. So again, it's the rule of reason. Where is harm actually being perpetrated by one of these big companies instead of simply erasing both the Casablanca and the Yelp example all under the same rule of law rubric, which
Right.
is what I'm saying is wrong with these laws, is that they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They're not giving consumers. I can see that Casablanca cost me $1.99, $4.99 from Amazon, but only $1.99 from somebody else. I can do that myself. But I'm reading information on the internet and I don't know where it's come from, and that's harming the places where that information is actually coming from, or Amazon using third-party data. Oliver pointed out this great thing, which is part of this law, is there was this bag maker called Peak Design, and they created this really cool camera bag. Well, it was very popular, and so Amazon knocked it off. And the company Peak Design read this very snarky ad about how Amazon's version is really a piece of S, and we're doing all of this. And Amazon is arguing, oh, we didn't peek into their user data to find out that it's doing well, when obviously they did. And even Jeff Bezos admits that it happens. So again, there's baby and there's bathwater. There's instances where there is clear harm, and there's instances where the things that they're attempting to outlaw, overall actually has some good aspects to it. So I think that these bills need to be nuanced in order to do what they're intended to do, which is to stop bad things from happening and allow good things to continue to happen under the same self-preferencing or whatever the other aspect is involved here. Well,
we're out of time here. I know that you're very passionate about these topics. Let's hope for some more balance, in our elected officials. Balance is not a word that you typically hear out of Washington.
Or hope.
I know you'll be following it closely, and I'm sure we'll tee this topic up again in the near future. Stuart, thanks again for taking the time to join me for today's podcast. For our viewing and listening audience, thanks for making the Smart Tech Check podcast part of your day or commute. Please make sure that you hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of today's podcast. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Mark Vina Tech Guy. And until next time, have a great week. And Stuart, thanks again for participating in today's podcast.